Hello and welcome to our first lecture on natural law theory. We'll have a total of three different parts to this, so please take a look at the other two parts as you need to. Now, natural law theory is an important theory for us to look at because it represents a form of morality that many people across the planet believe. It also happens to have a very long historical tradition, dating back to the 13th century. Natural law theory is the primary form of ethics that's utilized within Catholicism. Because of that, it's very important that we try to understand this because many people across our earth follow various forms of natural law theory. Now, before we get deeper into it, we need to figure out what we mean by natural law. This is kind of an unusual term. Now, this isn't referencing to things such as human nature quite in the same way that we normally think it would. Natural law is going to refer to moral laws or principles that, like the laws of the legal system, tell us how we should behave. Now, within Catholicism, for example, there are differences between natural law and divine law, things such as that. But natural law is going to be the kind of law that affects. Now, the idea of natural law tells us that there are certain laws, or certain forms of morality, that is, that are different from the laws of any particular society. So implicit within this, we're going to see a rejection of moral relativism. What they believe is that natural laws are based out of human nature, and human nature is universal. So there are certain ways in which we are created or exist as human beings, something about our human nature that should provide us with the basis for trying to understand how we should live ethically. So let's take a look at our structure of our theory. Our theory of the right is going to involve this idea that we should act in such a way that we do not directly violate basic goods. We'll go much deeper into this, as you can imagine. Our theory of the good is going to involve a perfectionistic theory of value. Again, we'll go further into this. Non-moral values are going to be those things which perfect human nature. Ultimately, these are going to lie in four primary values. And then the praiseworthy or blameworthiness of a moral agent is going to depend on how they act to perfect human nature. This brings us to at least our initial theory in a nutshell. Our theory of the right states that there we are. Sorry. An action is right if and only if failing to do it would result in a direct violation of one or more of basic goods. And the four basic goods that perfect human nature are life, procreation, knowledge, and sociability. Now we're going to try to figure out how we get to both of these throughout these lectures. Now, in order to do so, we need to understand, at least at first, our three basic components of natural law theory. These are going to involve a perfectionistic theory of value, the principle of double effect, which is going to end up ultimately being our decision-making procedure, and this idea about moral absolutism. So let's get a little deeper into these. We'll start out with our perfectionist theory of value. St. Thomas Aquinas was a 13th century monk who developed this theory. Aquinas taught at the university in Paris, which is the first modern university. And one thing that we see Aquinas do, which is maybe marks the beginning of the end of the, so to speak, the Dark Ages or the medieval period, is that Aquinas ends up, in essence, Christianizing to some extent Aristotle. Up to this point, much of Christian thought had been based out of Plato and Platonism and what we call Neoplatonism. But the rise of Islam and their adoption of Aristotelian logic and of Aristotelian science and so forth ended up providing a grave threat to this Neoplatonism. It made more sense, ultimately. And so Aquinas, recognizing that the ways Islamic scholars such as Averroes and Avicenna were using using Aristotle, brought Aquinas to realize that we needed to look at Aristotle. Aristotle ends up being the basis, in essence, for much of what we see in natural law theory. Now, there is a significant difference from what Aristotle states about ethics, but we'll get to that later in the semester. For Aristotle defined a thing's essential nature as that what makes it what it is. And in order to understand this nature, we have to understand the thing's purpose or end. Aristotle believed that all things in nature have purposes, and that in order to understand the essence, or its natural characteristics, what makes it what it is, we have to know that purpose. Now let's take an example of this. Let's say we're looking at a knife. We may say that the function of a knife is to cut, and we define how good a knife is based on how well it cuts. Well, for humans, this is going to be a little more complex. The thing which is perfection, or is a good for a human being, involves basically being in a state in which the things that are characteristic of us can be fully developed and engaged. Aquinas believes that we have free will, and that because we have free will, we get reason out of this. Now, this relates back as well to Aristotle's idea of rationality. Aquinas believes that we have the ability to understand and achieve the good via rationality and rational action. Furthermore, we should develop these characteristics. There's not the belief that we're born inherently with fully developed rationality, but instead we should work to influence these things. We should work to shape these things which are characteristic of us, things that define our purpose or our end. This leads Aquinas to his idea of value perfectionism. That is, that the goodness exists in relation to something that is a matter of its fully developing those capacities that are essential to it. That is, that in order for us to understand our perfection, we have to develop those capacities that would allow us to do so. When we apply morality to it, we get moral perfectionism. The perfectionistic account of value is central in understanding the nature of right and wrong action. So this brings us ultimately to our theory of non-moral value. A theory of non-moral value here for natural law theory is going to state that some state of affairs is intrinsically good in relation to human beings if and only if the realization of it is part of what perfects human nature, part of what perfects us. Well, what are these things that perfect us? According to Aquinas, rational observation of us, of humans, of our natural inclinations, reveals that there are four basic goods. This involves life, procreation, and sociability. Aquinas writes, there is in man, first, an inclination to the good that he shares by nature with all substances, since every substance seeks to preserve itself according to its own nature. Corresponding to this inclination, the natural law contains those things that preserve human life and prevent its destruction. With regards to procreation. Secondly, there is in man an inclination to certain more specific ends in accordance with the nature that he shares with other animals. In accordance with this, the natural law is said to contain what nature has taught all animals, such as the union of man and woman, the education of children, etc. And then when we look at social bonds and knowledge. Thirdly, a natural inclination to the good of the rational nature in which he is alone, or which is his alone. Thus, man has a natural inclination to know the truth about man and to live in society. Thus, the things that pertain to inclinations of this kind belong to the natural law, such as that man should avoid ignorance, that he should not offend others with whom he must associate, and other related actions. Timmins writes further, we can summarize this discussion in 3 points. Aquinas embraces a perfectionistic theory of value, according to which the good in relation to human beings is a matter of their achieving a state of perfection by fully realizing those ends or purposes that are essential in being human. 2, those ends or purposes that are essential to human beings are reflected in natural human inclinations and dispositions, and so we can consult such inclinations and dispositions in coming to a more precise understanding of what constitutes human perfection. And 3, upon investigation, we find that life, procreation, knowledge, sociability are the basic ends of human nature whose realization perfects human nature and thus count as the most basic goods for human beings. Now notice here talking about rational observation. So we need to get an idea of what he means by rationality. Here we can adopt a lot of material from Aristotle. For Aristotle, there were two basic forms of reason: theoretical reason and practical reason. Whenever we think, we develop hierarchies of ordered propositions that allow us to derive specific propositions from general propositions. So let's think about this. Let's say I'm looking at science. In science, we try to develop general propositions that may help us to explain specific things. We derive specific things from these general things, from these general ideas. So, for example, let's say that I'm hungry. Well, I may be able to derive from that I'm hungry for something, that I have a craving for something. So I get to a point where I'm more and more specific with regards to what I'm creating, what kind of things I'm proposing. Now, the most basic proposition, according to Aristotle's form of categorical logic, is the principle of contradiction, that something cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time, that we cannot say that something is and is not at the same point. Therefore, all basic propositions are self-evident and can be known on the basis of rational reflection and upon the proposition in question, and that we can know these things deductively with certainty. Now, remember back when we talked about argumentation, we talked a little bit about deduction and then how that gives us certainty. According to Aristotle, and therefore Aquinas as well, the basic knowledge, basic human goods, life, knowledge, procreation, and sociability, are self-evident. We don't have to argue about these things. Through application of our rationality to our observation of human behavior, we can see that these four things are inherently good. That brings us to at least our first conception of right conduct, that life, procreation, knowledge, and sociability are to be preserved and promoted. Their hindrance and destruction are to be avoided. Now, this isn't going to be quite as robust as we might like to think it is. Also note, for example, on pages 72 and 73 in your text, in Moral Theory, Timmons lists constitute life, knowledge, procreation, and sociability. So, from this at least initial idea of what these things should look like, we end up coming to our second idea. That is that we come to this idea that there's a hierarchy of moral truths. That is that we end up initially with fundamental moral principles. So that is, our fundamental moral principles are going to involve the promotion of these four basic goods. These will lead us to generating moral rules about general topics, and then we can get to particular moral verdicts about specific actions. So we're going to base, ultimately, our decision-making procedure out of this conception of the good. After all, our theory of the good here is what's informed our theory of the right. We may be able to say, therefore, that the theory of the good is more primary in this situation to our theory of the right. But that ultimately brings us to the question of how do we deal with moral conflicts? Can natural law theory give us guidance in cases where it is not possible to do both good and avoid evil? Well, asking this question is going to force us to address the consistency of the theory. According to this theory, basic values are incommensurable with each other. There's no common scale of measurement between them, so that we cannot, for example, say that, for example, something, therefore we should do it. All these things are basic. They're all on the same level. And so the question of intentionality has then become remarkably important within our decision-making procedure. Check in our next lecture as we go deeper into the decision-making procedure for natural law theory.